I'm here because I'm both worried and excited. Worried because I hear that Australia is starting to pursue American criminal justice policies. And I must say, it's awfully good sport of all of you to listen to an American talk about crime control policy. It's like listening to the architect of the Titanic explain how to design ships. But it does look like Australia is moving in the direction of, though not yet close to, US-style incarceration rates. And I want to explain why I think that's a horrible idea, but also why the alternative that was offered in the US, and I'm sure is being offered here, of just being nice to socially excluded people and hoping the crime will go away as a result, is an equally unpromising approach. So with Machiavelli, I want to praise cruelty used well and talk about what that would look like. So my ethical stance starts from the notion that both crime and punishment are bad things and we should look to minimize both of them. Now, at first blush, there would seem to be a trade-off. If we want less crime, it might seem we would have to punish more. Right? That's, for example, Gary Becker's economic theory of crime. And I want to suggest that that's not right for two reasons. I'm sure there are more. But I want to offer arguments from two really quite different research traditions. So I'm going to ask you to have to shift mental gears in the midst of this. So the first thought here comes from game theory, theory of interactive decisions, and some of you will recognize all of this as a sort of plagiarism from my teacher, Thomas Schelling. I want to argue that high violation rates are a social trap. They're one of two equilibria which are self-sustaining in a situation. And that's true because of a mechanism of positive feedback. The claim at its simplest is that in a situation where there is more offending than there is capacity to punish offending, which is generally the situation, when that's true, then even if you had, I will argue later that we don't have, but even if you had perfectly rational, self-interested offenders, it would still be true that no offender could compute an optimal level of offending in the Gary Becker tradition without knowing what the other offenders are up to. The risk of punishment is a function of how many other people are breaking the same rule at the same time and how much capacity there is to enforce against violations of that rule. If you come from Boston, where I lived for a long time, where everyone parks illegally, parking illegally is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The probability that you'll get a ticket is not very high because there are only a limited number of people to write tickets, and there are an unlimited number of illegally parked cars. If you're in Minneapolis, on the other hand, where all the Norwegians are very well behaved, parking illegally will get you a ticket every time. So those are both, I want to claim, stable equilibria of the same system, which, by the way, I think makes a lot of the historical inquiry about, the sociological inquiry about why different communities have different crime rates somewhat misplaced. Because the answer may turn out to be that community X has a high crime rate because it has a high crime rate. And therefore violations in that community are relatively safe. And community Y has a low crime rate because it has a low crime rate, and therefore violations in that community are relatively dangerous. If you grow up in a neighborhood where there's lots of offending and not much enforcement compared to the amount of offending, then it will be true both that the rewards to you of committing crimes are higher, net of punishment, than they would otherwise be, and that the rewards to you of not committing crime, of trying to pursue some lawful enterprise are also smaller because your security is less and because the economic opportunities are likely to be less, since crime drives away economic opportunity by driving away people who can move. So in distinction from lots of people who are on my side of the argument about how many prison cells to have, I don't want at all to minimize the importance of ordinary predatory blue-collar criminality, which imposes enormous costs. Not so much the cost of completed victimization, which when you compute them turn out not to be very high. I haven't done the numbers for Australia. In the United States, where burglary is an important crime that people worry about a lot, the average loss per household per month to burglary is on the order of $4. It's the sort of unnoticed variation in your utility bill. And yet I say that people aren't irrational to be concerned about burglary, because part of the reason burglary costs are low is people have moved out of high burglary neighborhoods. The costs of crime avoidance dominate the costs of completed crime. And since it's very easy to measure completed crime and very hard to measure crime avoidance costs, that frustrates the criminological enterprise. Most criminologists, as far as I can tell, have simply decided to ignore that fact and run with the data sets they have. But in the US, we were celebrating a huge decrease in the crime rate, more than 50% in most measured rates of completed crime since 1994. Without computing at all what fraction of that is people taking more precaution, starting with moving out of high crime neighborhoods, but also keeping their children home, triple locking their doors, getting alarm systems, all of that. I grew up in Baltimore. Some of you have probably seen The Wire. The neighborhood where The Wire takes place is Park Circle. I was a baseball fan as a teenager, and cheap. And the most cost-effective way to see baseball was to go to a doubleheader, a two-game series played in the evening. Right? So I could leave home at 5 o'clock, change buses at Park Circle, take the other bus to the stadium, watch two baseball games for a couple of dollars, and take the same two buses back, changing at Park Circle at midnight. That was not considered by my parents or anybody else to be risky behavior. That was a perfectly normal thing to do in 1964. No middle-class child growing up in an American big city has the freedom I had. That's the cost of crime. And, of course, the social tension that goes with that. Everyone knows that poverty and racism are causes of crime. I think it's underestimated the extent to which crime is among the supporting causes of poverty by driving away opportunity and racial tension. So, let me show you a model. That's not the model I wanted to show. Sorry about that. It'll be up in a minute. There we are. Okay. So, imagine that each of these squares is a person. For concreteness, imagine a probation officer with a caseload of 100. These are the 100 probationers that person's supposed to supervise. I don't know how conditions are here in the US. That would be a remarkably small caseload for a big city probation officer. Los Angeles runs about 150. The color of the square is that person's propensity to break some rule. Let's, for concreteness, say, to use illicit drugs. And each period we observe that. the probationer comes in for his monthly drug test. And the light colors are low probabilities. The dark colors are high probabilities, ranging from 5% to 95%. This program was set up so the lowest was 95 and the highest was 5, and it was an even distribution across that. But these are randomly drawn. So we start out with a mean violation probability of 48%. Each round, according to the probability, randomly, the person does or does not break the rule. That's demonstrated by a circle. Circle's a violation. So this person was very likely to violate and did. This person was very unlikely to violate but did anyway. This person, as one would have expected, didn't break the rule, but this high probability person also didn't break the rule. Again, it happens at random. This round we got 52 sanctions. We would have expected 48, right? Statistical variation. Now the interesting part. The slashes in the circles represent people who were punished, because the probation officer, having a finite amount of time in her month, can only write up 8 sanctions reports. So no matter how many people break the rule, only 8 of them can be punished for it. And the rule of motion of the system is that if you get away with it, your probability of breaking the rule the next time goes up by 5 percentage points, if it's not already at its maximum. And if you break the rule and are punished for it, your probability of violating next time goes down by 10 percentage points, if it's not already at the minimum. Right, so we're not doing rational offenders here, we're just doing straight mechanical Skinnerian response to sanctions. But what's going to happen over time? Note, here's the average probability of violation for the whole group. And it started to go up. After all, in that first round, 52 people broke the rule, 8 were sanctioned, decreasing their probability, and 44 were not sanctioned, increasing their probability. This will end in tears. I should have said at the beginning, I have an outline, and if I don't get through it, you won't know and I won't care. So instead of the convention of holding questions to the end, let me invite questions and comments as we go along. And this isn't Jeopardy, so you needn't conceal your comment in the form of a question. You can simply say, "You're wrong because," and we can go from there. All right, this thing is saturated out. We might as well not be punishing these people at all. Now, so someone might say, well, increase the amount of punishment. Let's have 12 sanctions available instead of only 8. That should help. Not. Once the probability starts to go up, it's essentially got momentum because the risk is going down. This will saturate just the same way, only a little bit more slowly. So this result represents the view of the people who think that punishment is just the worthless imposition of pain for no good purpose. And sometimes it is. But whenever I read a paper that says, deterrence doesn't work or punishment doesn't work, I imagine that someone's done a study of sex, concentrating entirely on same-sex pairings, and concluded that sex never leads to pregnancy. It matters a lot whether you do it right or not. All right, this is not helping. However, what if we had, let's say, 20 sanctions? Right, so now 49 people have broken the rule, but 20 of them are being punished for it. And remember, in this hypothetical model, this isn't based on data, the effect of a punishment is a little stronger than the effect of getting away with it. So let's see how this goes. Notice this curve has started to go down. Once it goes down, it's going to keep going down. It's basically an epidemic S curve. And notice, not only are we getting more compliance than we had, less non-compliance than we had the other way, we're actually punishing fewer people. If you have adequate capacity to punish, and the offenders respond to punishment by violating less, then the consequence of increasing your capacity to punish may be not needing to use it as much. Or as my teacher Thomas Schelling said in discussing nuclear deterrence, the perfect threat never needs to be carried out. Right? Punishments are threats, right? If you do X, we will do Y. Threats need to be carried out to maintain their credibility. But actually carrying out the threat represents defeat, not victory. Punishment is a cost, not a benefit. And again, if this kind of positive feedback thing works, it may be the case that having a little bit of punishment capacity is absolutely the worst thing you could have. You're better off having enough to drive the violation rate down far enough so that a high conditional probability of punishment is consistent with low actual punishment, because not many people meet the condition. All right. But everyone knows the story of the economist stranded on a desert island with lots of tinned food, but no can opener. Right? What's the economist do in that case? Takes out his blackboard and writes on it, "Assume a can opener." Right? I've just assumed away the capacity constraint. I've assumed that this probation officer has 2.5 times as much capacity as she actually has. All right. Sometimes you could actually find that additional capacity, but not always. Though the suggestion here is, if you had some additional capacity for a while, you could use it, drive the need for it down, and then pull that capacity off, maintaining your new equilibrium. Once the population looks like this, you don't need 20 sanctions capacity. 5 is plenty. All right. But if you can't assume a can opener, well, perhaps you could do something else. I'm going to take us back to 8 sanctions. Oops. I'm going to take us back to 8 sanctions, but I'm going to create a new rule. Instead of choosing offenders at random for punishment, let's set a priority order. So we number them from 1 to 100, and the rule is that the 8 lowest numbered violators get punished. Now, in this model, nobody's being told anything. They just discover what happens to them as it happens. If you think about the real world, you'd actually want to warn people, both because that's fair, and because the faster they comply, the less punishment you actually have to put out. So the notion is to say to a group of offenders, hey, you, this is what you're doing that we don't want you doing anymore. And here's what's going to happen to you every time you do it. Right? But that's not in here. Now, this is just mechanical. We've set it up so that those first few people will get sanctioned every time. And now let's see what happens. Notice 2 things are happening. The mean violation rate started to go up because all the folks down here are going completely crazy. They're essentially not under any threat at all. But look at the top. The first 8 people can never get away with breaking the rule. Now again, on this model they don't know that, so they might violate anyway. But every time they do, they get sanctioned, so their probability can only go down. As their probability of violation goes down, then the risk facing the next group goes up. And what we see is the board slowly being bleached from the top. Now, again, I'm not claiming I can cure crime on a computer, right? This is just a simulation. But what I want to establish is the conceptual possibility that you can take a limited amount of sanctions capacity and multiply its value by concentrating it on a subset of offenders, of offenses, of offense types, by geography, by time, by space. Take your pick. Instead of futilely trying to control everything everywhere, try to control something somewhere. And once you have part of the universe under control, once the violation rates go down, you can move capacity out of that segment into some other segment. And eventually, again, we're right where we were with the additional capacity. It took us a little longer to get there. We didn't add any capacity. We just used the capacity we had to make it the case for each group of offenders that it just didn't make sense to keep breaking the rule. Now, Bo Kilmer and I have a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy that does this with fully rational actors who are, have a benefit from breaking the rule and a cost of being punished and probabilities of punishment that they're Bayesian updating based on their experience. We don't get quite the same behavior, but it's qualitatively very much the same result. So the total punishment is an inverted U in punishment capacity. Having a little bit, you don't punish much. Having a lot, you don't punish much. Having some, you punish a whole bunch. And you can reduce the amount of punishment you actually need by concentrating it. Okay, let me pause there, see what the reactions are to that, and then I want to get on to beating up on Gary Becker. Thoughts? No? All right. Put this guy back to sleep. All right. So, that was about offenders who respond mechanically, or alternatively, who are fully rational actors doing, Bayesian updating on their probability of getting punished. Gary Becker did a model in the 1960s, he called the economic theory of crime, which assumed many can openers, but basically demonstrated that, or assumed that, people would commit crimes if and only if the expected value of committing the crime was higher than the alternative. That suggests that ratcheting up the severity of punishment ought to be a good way to control crime, right? If we had the death penalty for parking illegally, you wouldn't have to write many parking tickets to convince rational actors not to park illegally. Well, no, actually. Cesare Beccaria showed otherwise in 1750. And if there's one lesson to learn from Beccaria is if you have a brilliant idea, don't write it down in Italian. Because then Jeremy Bentham will steal all your ideas, including the term utility, write them in English and get famous for them. But Beccaria says there are three characteristics of a punitive threat that determine its efficacy as a deterrent. Its swiftness, its certainty, and its severity. And he says of the three, severity is the least important. If a punishment is swift and certain, it needn't be severe to be effective. If it's not swift or certain, even making it severe will leave it ineffective. Beccaria was arguing against torture and capital punishment. James Q. Wilson, in a passage in Thinking About Crime that few of his conservative friends noticed, points out that severity is not merely a poor alternative to swiftness and certainty. Severity is the enemy of swiftness and certainty. The more severe a punishment is, the more due process you need to administer it, the more it will be resisted by whoever's being punished. And if you're handing out punishment in the form of prison cells or jail cells, the faster you're filling up your prisons and jails, right? They're not Hilbert's Hotel. They can't take an infinite number of new guests. And therefore, the legislative reflex of increasing sentence length whenever some crime type gets to be problematic is exactly wrong. Now, it would be right if offenders were rationally calculating their chances. But in fact, now I've not done these numbers for Australia, but I bet I'd get the same result. I've done them for the US. Ordinary blue-collar crime, burglary, auto theft, street robbery, store robbery, low-level drug dealing. All of those offenses, even back in 1975 when we had lots of crime and not very much punishment, all of those offenses are net disadvantageous if your alternative is picking up bottles on the street for return. Certainly advantageous if you had a good job like flipping burgers at McDonald's. As Peter Reuter likes to say, the wages of sin are well below the lawful minimum. A burglary in the US cost the homeowner about $1,200. About 20% of that is actually net reward to the burglar because fences aren't especially generous. Back in 1976, which was the trough, the average burglary, if I took all of the burglaries and all of the time spent behind bars for burglary and simply divided to compute the expected value, the answer was 6 days. And the first time I did that computation, I said, wow, Jim Wilson was right. We have too much crime because we have not enough punishment. It was only years later that I did the other half of the equation, which is, wait a minute, $240, 6 days, $40 a day. So people are spending time in jail at less than $2 an hour. That does not sound like a very attractive deal. Now the deal in the US is much worse. The rate of burglary is down by half. The burglars behind bars are up a factor of 3. So now people are spending time behind bars for burglary at the rate of something like 40 cents an hour. Now, a couple things to notice about this. The burglary deal is now 6 times worse than it used to be. And yet burglaries are only down 50%, suggesting that the price elasticity of demand for burglary opportunities is not very high. But the other thing it suggests is that burglars are not rationally computing their odds. Why do people keep committing burglaries? Well, the reward for a burglary is relatively certain and immediate. The punishment is deferred and uncertain, right? The probability of being caught for any particular burglary is 1 in 20. The probability of being caught for any particular retail crack deal is 1 in 15,000. Now, again, the punishments are heavy enough so that somebody who makes a habit of either of those crimes will spend a lot of time behind bars. But if you happen to be very present-oriented and not very risk-averse, it might look like a pretty good deal. So Kahneman and Tversky have shown us why Bacciaria was right. I mean, Bacciaria just waves his hands at the argument. He asserts that swiftness and certainty matter and that severity doesn't. He doesn't really say why. But now we know that somebody with an even slightly exaggerated normal bias toward the present and bias toward the certain might find crime attractive. That would be particularly true in a neighborhood where, again, the rewards of crime, the cost of committing crime, the risk of punishment is lower, and the reward of not committing a crime is also lower because the economic opportunities aren't very good and because whatever property you acquire is subject to criminal aggression. That suggests, what I think is true, that criminal offenders, particularly frequent offenders, particularly people who keep offending after they've been punished, and those folks account for a very large fraction of the total crime. We only had to deal with offenses by first-time offenders. We wouldn't have many to deal with. those behaviors will be concentrated in people who are particularly present-oriented and prospect theoretic in their risk behavior. Or if we want to move to a different set of research traditions, people who have low impulse control, low capacity to defer gratification, external locus of control, poor self-command. There are about 6 different ways to get at that. Frustratingly, those research traditions don't talk to each other. So if I see a paper on somebody's hyperbolic discount rate, it will never tell me what that person's locus of control was. And so I have no idea whether I just named 4 different but related phenomena or one phenomenon measured 4 different ways. And I'm not aware in the criminology literature of much in the way of systematic measurement of any of these characteristics across offenders. Does everybody here know about the marshmallow test? Okay, I see a couple of nods, but take a bunch of 7-year-old boys, sit them down, put a marshmallow in front of each one of them, say, I'm going to leave the room now. When I come back, everyone who still has his marshmallow, who hasn't eaten it yet, gets a second marshmallow as well. Now the claim is, and I'm told there's some doubt about how accurately this experiment was done the first time, but the claim is that knowing whether the boy waited is an extremely strong predictor of school discipline problems, school dropout, school performance, going to college, juvenile justice involvement, adult criminal justice involvement, and among those who aren't offenders, success in any career track. Right? People who can wait do better than people who can't wait. That, I think, was a very beautiful experiment. An even more beautiful experiment was performed 2 years ago. In my next life, I absolutely want to be a social psychologist. They get to do the coolest stuff. So here's the experiment. We're going to do the marshmallow test, except we're going to do something else first. We're going to take each kid, sit him down alone with 5 crayons and a sheet of paper, and tell him that he's in a drawing contest and that there's going to be a prize for the best drawing. And as he picks up the first crayon, the experimenter says, 5 crayons isn't really very much. Would you like to wait and I'll see if I can get you a whole box? And almost all the kids, they're in a contest after all. They want the advantage of having more crayons to work with. So they say, yes, I'll wait and get the whole box. Experimenter goes away, comes back 10 minutes later and says, I'm sorry the supply room was out. You'll just have to do with the 5 crayons you started with. Okay, so they do their drawings. We throw them away because we weren't actually doing an experiment on drawings. Now we do the marshmallow test. And guess what? Nobody waits. So it's possible that, yes, there is a trait-like characteristic of ability to defer gratification that varies from individual to individual, can be measured, maybe even can be manipulated, and that matters. But it's also true that there's a state-like characteristic that relates to particular circumstances, and that people who have been disappointed in the results of waiting won't wait. Well, guess what? If I grow up in a poorly founded family and a chaotic neighborhood, the linkage between my behavior and my outcome in the near term is very loose indeed. And I am well advised to grab what I can while the grabbing is good. Right? First rule of decision analysis, life is uncertain, eat dessert first. Bad parenting, that is, say, high crime neighborhoods, and a criminal justice system that rewards and punishes mostly at random, which includes the probation and parole system, could not be better designed to breed career criminals. To breed people whose capacity to shape their behavior around what they're told to do is extremely poor. I want to claim that anybody who's ever successfully raised a child or trained a puppy or coached a sports team or managed an office knows the principles that modify human behavior. Right? People will modify their behavior in response to clear rules where there are clear sanctions for the rule violations. They happen every time. They're not severe. They happen right away. And everything's explained up front. So the process is transparently fair, and where there's apparent goodwill from the person doing the punishment toward the person being punished. After all, it is disgraceful to knuckle under to illegitimate authority. Anybody with any self-respect will resist that demand. If the punishment system is transparently fair and based on good intention toward the person under control, then it's not at all disgraceful. And that partly depends on consistency. Right? So it seems to me that the current operations of the probation system, where most violations go undetected because we don't watch very closely, and most detected violations lead to no actual consequence, merely a warning from the probation officer, don't do that again. But an occasional violation, the 6th or the 9th or the 14th, leads to a drastic sanction, is the worst of all possible worlds. If you wanted to make somebody a high-rate offender, that's the way you'd do it. What the probation officer and the judge think of as clinical judgment and tempering justice with mercy looks to the offender like randomness and whim. When the offender finally gets punished for his 9th violation, he's not likely to say, oh, I guess if I do that, I get punished. He's likely to say, the probation officer must have been mad at me, because I've done that before and nothing happened. My friends did it today and nothing happened to them. It must be because I'm black. Not a good position to be in. So, how many people here know about the Hope trial in Hawaii? Okay. This has now been done in a number of places. I'm going to tell you about the results of a randomized controlled trial in Hawaii, because that's the only large-scale RCT we have. But do not think of pineapples and beaches when I tell you about this. We got the same results in Sacramento. We got the same results in Seattle. We got the same results in rural Texas. I mean, the same results down to the same curves. So, judge goes on the bench in Hawaii, having been the United States Attorney, that is the chief federal prosecutor. Probation officers are bringing the judge probationers for revocation, which means going off to prison, with 6 or 9 or 12 violations, typically either missed drug tests or positive drug tests. In Hawaii, as in many American states, somebody on felony probation comes in once a month to meet with a probation officer and is drug tested at that time. That appointment is scheduled a month in advance. Methamphetamine, which is the dominant drug in Hawaii, is detectable for 72 hours. So to pass your monthly drug test, all you have to do is not use for 72 hours that you know about. 20% of the felony probationers who are meth users come in dirty, and 10% don't come in at all. And I've gotten that same result looking at 3 different probation departments in California. It looks like that's about a universal result. Why? Because the usual response is, don't do that again. And the usual response to a second offense is, don't do that again. And the usual response to a third offense is, if you keep doing that, something bad will happen. And the fourth offense, next time we're seeing the judge. And the fifth offense, look, this is your last warning. How's the poor guy supposed to know which was his really last warning? My guess is the probation officer doesn't even know. The decision's made on the spot. And as a result, when the sanction happens, it comes as random aggressive whim. So the judge looked at this situation and said to the probation officers, this is absurd. This is the guy's ninth. I understand why you want me to revoke the guy. It's his ninth violation. What'd you do the first 8 times? And the PO said, well, we worked with him. We talked to him. We jawboned him. And the judge said, no, you wouldn't raise your kid that way. And the PO said, yeah, but we've got caseloads of 180. We've got a 30% violation rate. That means that each of us has more than 50 violations per month to deal with. It takes 4 hours to write up the paperwork for a revocation. There aren't that many hours in our month. And if we wrote them all up, a revocation hearing is a half day. 50 of them from each one of us every month. We can't do it, and you can't do it. And the judge said, yeah, but I want a report on the first violation. And they said, Your Honor, is there some part of impossible you'd like us to explain more slowly? We can't do that. And then the judge, the imam, had an insight. Being much more reasonable than the average judge, he said, okay, we'll compromise. Make me a list of the people who have violated so often that the next time you'd bring them to me. Now again, I think he was asking for what didn't exist, because I think those decisions were being made on the spot. But they could all make up that list. And so we got 35 names. Called them all into the courtroom for a brand new judicial process he made up on the spot, which he called a warning hearing. And if you go to the Hawaii Judiciary website, you can get the script of the warning hearing, which suggests to me that was awake when he took introductory psych in college. It is a masterpiece. First sentence, everyone in this courtroom wants you to succeed on probation. Right? Establish goodwill. And then he said, but you really haven't been doing your bit. Right? Probation was a deal. You did something we could have sent you to prison for, but we didn't. And you were therefore supposed to keep some rules. But you haven't been, right? So from now on, every violation of probation will lead to an immediate sanction. And remember, he's dealing with 35 people, so he can actually carry out that threat. He said, I can't control what you do. I can only control what I do. And if you break the rule, I will send you to jail. And then there's lots more that goes into the speech. But essentially what happened was he gave everybody a phone number to call and a color code. You're purple 2. There's a random number generator that picks a set of color codes for every day. Each probationer every morning during the business week has to call in to find out whether it's his day to come in for a drug test. At the beginning, he's got a color that's going to come up 6 times a month. With periods of sustained compliance, it phases down to 4 times a month, twice a month, eventually once a month. The sanctions started at 2 weeks. And my one contribution to this after the judge called me, having found my old paper on this, describing what he'd just done 20 years before we did it, my one contribution was to say, try 2 days. And as far as we can tell, the behavioral response is invariant to the severity of the sanction. 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, all the same. In the 24/7 program, which I'll tell you about in a second, they've actually got it down to an hour in a holding cell. In New York City, in the Kleiman program, which we're just about to start, the first sanction is going to be a weekend at home, right? Home confinement. And the second sanction is going to be a week on a 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew enforced with a GPS monitor. Curfew, I think, is way underutilized. In any case, Hawaii was jail. And so the judge braced for a bunch of hearings. 35 people picked for high noncompliance. Base rate of noncompliance was 30% a month. 30% of 35 is 10 and change. So he was ready for 10 hearings the first week. Oh, the other thing he did was he changed the process. He said to the probationers, why does it take 4 hours to write up a revocation notice? Well, I'm documenting 12 violations going back a year. And I have to document them with precision because the defense attorney is going to be fighting hard about his guy not going back to prison. The judge said, okay, but here he missed a drug test yesterday, right? Doesn't take a long time to write that down. So they redesigned the form. Now 2 sides of a sheet of paper, space for the probation officer's signature at the bottom, and the judge's fax number. PO takes 5 minutes to fill out the form. John Smith, offender number, date, violation type, signature in the fax machine, gone. PO does not have to come in for the hearing. Hearing takes a few minutes because there's nothing much to argue about, and we're only talking about a couple days anyway. First week there were 3 sanctions hearings. Second week there were none. Over a year, well, eventually Angela Hawken at Pepperdine got them to do a full randomized controlled trials. 500 people in the study, 2/3 experimental, 1/3 control. Of the experimentals, the modal violation number was 0. The mean violation number was slightly more than 1. Fewer than 15% had 4 or more. Nobody was sent to drug treatment unless he accumulated multiple violations. Anybody who wanted drug treatment could have it. Very few of them did. Somebody came in with 3 dirty tests in a row, the drugstore was likely to say, okay, would you like a residential treatment program or a prison cell? And I call the residential treatment program and they have a bed for you right now. Because if you don't insist on treating everybody, you can treat the people you need to treat seriously. So Hawken has a paper on this called Behavioral Triage, arguing against the expensive and elaborate risk and needs assessment process. Best predictor of behavior is behavior. If I want to know whether somebody has a serious drug problem, I tell him he's going to go to jail every time he uses. And I see who keeps using. Right? DSM-4, continued use in the face of adverse consequences. You've made your diagnosis. And you've created the therapeutic alliance because, after all, now the guy's going to treatment knowing that if he fails, the alternative is prison. The treatment providers in Hawaii absolutely love this because it sends them willing participants, or at least eager to succeed participants, even if they're not actually willing. This has been done in a number of jurisdictions. Again, that's the place where we had the randomized trial. We did another randomized trial with parolees, more serious people coming out of prison. In Seattle, same results. Cut their days behind bars by 2/3. Cut their new offenses by, well, in that case, 3/4, but that was 1 compared to 4, so that's not really a measure. In Hawaii, we seem to have cut new offenses by about a factor of 2. Program more than pays for itself because you can do an awful lot of supervision to save a year in jail. In South Dakota, completely independently, without having read any of these papers, Larry Long took repeated DUI offenders. Right? South Dakota is the perfect storm for drunk driving. It's Norwegians and Ukrainians. It's got long winter nights. It's got miles and miles of nothing but miles and miles and absolutely nothing to do. 1/3 of the state prisoners in South Dakota are in for DUI. And they had at the beginning twice the national drunk driving fatality rate, even though the probability of 2 cars actually intersecting each other in South Dakota is close to 0. The place is uninhabited. Alcohol testing poses a different problem from drug testing because it's only detectable for a couple of hours. So the 24/7 program, the offenders have a choice. They can go off to prison, or they can agree to come in twice a day, 7 days a week, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. for a breathalyzer test, and if they don't blow 0, they go to jail. And they pay $1 for the test. 99.5%, and people take that deal because they really don't want to go away. 99.5% of those tests are taken and passed, which is consistent with the fact that 47% of the violators, of the clients, violate at least once. Well, these are people with serious drinking problems. Second time DUI means you're in bad trouble. Bo Kilmer at Rand, who's been evaluating this, finds not only a big effect on drunk driving that outlasts the program. The program's only 90 days. A 50% reduction in DUI recidivism lasts at least 2 years. We're also getting reductions in assaultive behavior, including domestic violence. So the ideology about domestic violence, that it's entirely a function of patriarchy and not at all of alcohol, just seems not to be true. You can make the guys not drink. Beating up on the girlfriend seems less attractive if you're sober. So I claim we can get out of the social trap. And we can do so in a way that reduces both violation rates and punishment rates. I want to add to drugs testing and alcohol testing, again, in each case where appropriate. And if people are remote, you can use a bracelet, a scram bracelet, that basically measures perspiration continuously. I want to add to that GPS position monitoring, which is a way you can enforce home confinement and curfew, but also a way to tell the offender, if you ever reoffend, we can put you at the site of the offense. Right? If there's a burglary, we're going to check where you were compared to where the burglary was and ask you what you were doing in that guy's apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning. I claim the combination of those will give us most of the benefit in crime control of a prison cell at a tiny fraction of the financial cost and an even smaller fraction of the suffering. And it seems to me that the program that says you have to not use drugs and you have to obey a curfew is something you could perfectly reasonably do to a first-time serious offender without worrying about criminalizing him by putting him in a system that's likely to get him caught. And so I want to fight the idea that the right way to deal with first offenders is to tell them to go be good boys from now on. It seems to me that no detected violation of the law should lead to no punishment if we can figure out a kind of punishment that actually helps people rather than harming them. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. We've got 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.